Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year. That's pretty loud. I am so happy to see you on a chilly night, but it is very, very warm here in this auditorium at Gambrell and the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina, to be at a truly community event tonight where the town and the gown come together to discuss and consider a very important topic on the minds of all of us, and that would be civility. And I am wearing a civility button this evening that Jim's associate gave to me, and I'm going to wear it, I think, for the rest of the year, if that's okay, Jim, because we need more of that. I'm so happy to be with you tonight and to welcome the Honorable Jim Leach, former congressman from the great state of Iowa, to our campus for this important lecture. Jim Leach is the 9th chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He was nominated by President Obama in July of 2009 and confirmed by the Senate. And he began his 4-year term as chairman of the NEH on the 12th of August 2009. For 30 years, Mr. Leach represented southeastern Iowa in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he chaired the Banking and Financial Services Committee, the Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, and the Congressional Executive Commission on China. In 2004, and I know he is very proud of this, he founded and co-chaired the Congressional Humanities Caucus. And that is the caucus in our House of Representatives that advocates for the importance of the humanities in American life and ensures caucus members will work together to intensify our country's awareness and our government's awareness and appreciation of disciplines, varied disciplines like history and literature and the study of language and philosophy and ethics and religion and art and music and photography and anthropology and linguistics and on and on. After leaving Congress in 2007, Jim joined the faculty at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, where he was the John L. Weinberg Visiting Professor of Public Affairs. In September of 2007, he took a year's leave of absence from Princeton and served as the interim director of the Institute of Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He graduated from Princeton, received an MA, a Master of Arts degree in Soviet politics from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and did additional graduate work at the London School of Economics. He resides, as he told me tonight, very part-time in Iowa City and mostly in the Washington, D.C. area with his wife Elizabeth, his son Gallagher, and daughter Jenny. His lecture this evening is entitled Civility in a Fractured Society. His visit is supported by our very own Humanities Council of South Carolina. Many of the board members and its staff and executive director, Randy Akers, is with us tonight, and we are so glad to be co-sponsoring this event with the Humanities Council. We're also delighted to have Jim Leach here as part of the university's ongoing initiative on the critical importance of promoting civil discourse. I've received a lot of feedback on this initiative, probably more feedback than I have for any other matter since becoming president. Well, then again, maybe I've received more football advice. And I have to tell you, the feedback has not been always supportive, but it's safe to say that it has been mainly supportive. And our sentiment is that the way we debate the tinderbox issues of the day, in my opinion, may be as important as the resolution to the issues. So let's now turn attentively to our lecturer tonight and, of course, show him the civil welcome for which South Carolina is known. Mr. Jim Leach. Welcome again.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President, and I must say I'm honored to join you in partial measure out of great respect for the most innovative university model for civility discussion in the country, and you've really made a mark. I'm also pleased to have had the opportunity to meet with an old friend, Sarah Schneckloth, who many of you don't know, but at the University of South Carolina is probably the leading young artist in the country today, and her biomorphic gesturalism has really gotten a lot of attention around the country. And I've also had the pleasure to meet with Eric Dockstader, who is a MacArthur-supported scholar here. And Eric's work on South Africa and the use of words in the ending of apartheid is very relevant to civility discussions here. And among other things, his essays on the subject have pointed out that there are words that can be used that bring people together and cause positive results in a most difficult civil setting. In fact, if you contrast the South African situation with our own history, where we probably had the finest words ever written in world politics in our declaration, but it took almost 2 centuries to bring and render meaning to those notions that we set down in the Declaration. In fact, for the majority of American history, the majority of Americans did not have the rights articulated in the Declaration. I must tell you a most pleasing discussion I had a few minutes ago at the President's residence with Walter Edgar. And the first revolutionary hero in my life as a pre-teenager was reading a biography of the Swamp Fox. And Walter mentioned to me an anecdote that I find almost equally heroic to his actions against the Redcoats. And he indicated that he was one of 2 votes in the South Carolina legislature against the Tory Act. And the Tory Act was an act that was designed for retribution against the Loyalists, in which there was an effort to, and a successful effort to not just disenfranchise, but to take property away from people who supported the crown, and in essence also to send Loyalists back to England. And so we have a rather enormous act of patriotism and civility from the state of South Carolina that I think is relevant for the country today. In any regard, if one thinks in the field of rhetoric, and I hate to step into Eric's field, but words reflect emotion as well as meaning, and they clarify or cloud thought, energize action, sometimes bring out the better angels in our nature, and sometimes lesser instincts. I tell people that I can't think of a subject that sounds duller than the notion of public manners. On the other hand, I think little is more important for our country at this time than to advance a greater respect for discussion in the public square. And one might even say there's an implicit need for a new social compact rooted in mutual respect and trust. The concept of civility itself implies politeness. But civil discourse is about more than good etiquette. At its core, civility requires respectful engagement, a willingness to consider other people's views and place them in the context of history and life experiences. Recent comments on the floor of the House of Representatives involving advocates on both sides of the healthcare debate have gathered a lot of attention, but vastly more rancorous socially divisive assertions are being made across the land. Public officials are being labeled fascist or communist, sometimes both. And more bizarrely, significant public figures and some public movements are toying with hints of what I consider to be history-blind radicalism, the precept of secession. And one might ask, what problem is there with a bit of hyperbole? And the logic, to paraphrase Marshall McLuhan's observation about the media, is the message. If 400,000 American soldiers sacrificed their lives to defeat fascism, and if tens of thousands gave their lives to hold communism at bay, and if we fought a civil war to preserve the Union, isn't it a citizen's obligation to put perspective to words that have warring implications? And there is, after all, a distinction between supporting a particular tax policy, spending policy, or healthcare view, and asserting that someone else holds to an ism of hate that involves gulags and concentration camps. Certain frameworks of thought define rival ideas. Other frameworks describe enemies. Citizenship is hard. It takes a commitment to listen, watch, read, think in ways that allow the imagination to put oneself in the shoes of another. Words do matter. In fact, stirring anger and playing on the irrational fears of others inflames hate, and when coupled with character assassination, polarizing rhetoric can exacerbate intolerance and perhaps impel violence. Conversely, just as demagoguery can jeopardize social cohesion, healing language, such as Lincoln's plea in his second inaugural for malice toward none, can uplift and help bring society together. And the choice for leaders is whether to opt for unifying statesmanship or opportunistic partisanship. Likewise, the challenge for citizens is to determine whom to reward with their vote. Those who respect diversity but favor a united, socially cohesive country, or those who press debilitating cultural wars or extreme ideological agendas. Care, however, has to be maintained to ensure that advocacy is never considered a thing to be avoided. Argumentation is a social good. Indeed, it is a prerequisite to blocking tyranny and avoiding dogmatism. So rather than policing language, the goal should be to uplift the tenor and tone of debate and infuse it with historical and philosophical perspective. The poet Walt Whitman once described America as an athletic democracy, and what he meant was that in the 19th century, politics were rugged and vigorous with spirited debates about immigration, imperialism, slavery. Things also got violent. Vice President Aaron Burr shot and killed the greatest Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in a duel triggered by Hamilton's claim that Burr was a despicable character. That judgment, by the way, was vindicated because at the duel, Hamilton turned and fired straight upwards, and then Burr carefully aimed his pistol and gunned him down. As it works out in a historical discovery analogous to the discoveries about Jefferson, only about 2 decades ago it was figured out that the pistols had been filed to the proverbial hair trigger, and that the strong probability is that Burr knew it, that Hamilton did not. Therefore, this might have been an act of murder. And I mention this because I think one has to stress that political treachery is not new. And what is new are transformative changes in communications technology, changes in American politics, and very deep changes in the issues that America faces in the world. In teaching at Harvard and Princeton, upon leaving Congress, I developed a series of what I call 2-minute courses in American governments, and I'd like to recite several of these. The first I call Political Science 101, and that is that the country over the past generation has been about 1/3 Democratic and 1/3 Republican and 1/3 no party, with lots of shifts within these numbers. And a year ago it looked like quite a bit more Democratic than Republican. Now it's getting to be evened out a bit again. But basic math tells us that 1/2 of 1/3 is 1/6. So that means that 1/6 of America controls the candidates in the Republican side, 1/6 in the Democratic side. But if you go to the issue of primary elections where candidates are chosen, at most, on average, 1 in 4 participate, but it's often 1 in 8 or 1 in 12. But if you go to the most side, 1 in 4, 1/4 times 1/6, again, if one is at all mathematical, is 1/24. And what this means is that 1/24 of Americans control the candidates on the Republican side, 1/24 of the Democratic. That 1/24 on the Republican side is quite conservative. That 1/24 on the Democratic is vigorously liberal. And so what is occurring in American politics is that the choices of candidates are getting to be more outside the middle than at any time in American history. I indicate this because if you go to what the founders thought of as our society, that you'd have representation for about everybody, the fact is the most underrepresented Americans in the United States Congress today is the majority of the American people that do not consider themselves on the edges of politics. And that is an extraordinary phenomenon that can only be dealt with by getting much more active involvement in the political parties at the basic level of primary elections. Political Science 102 is that in primaries for president, everybody in America kind of understands that Republican candidates articulate well to the right, Democratic candidates well to the left. And then in the general election, there's kind of a scoot to the center and a kind of a battle to be considered the most sympathetic to the middle. But in Congress, the distinction is that there is no scoot. And the reason that there's no scoot is that about about 80% of all congressional seats are gerrymandered or by happenstance are rather safe within one political party or the other. And it's about half and half. And in a safe seat, which after all is the overwhelming majority of Congress, particularly but not exclusively, a candidate of the furthest part of the right is likely to prevail in a primary, and a candidate of the furthest part of the left is likely to prevail in the other primary. And once nominated and or elected, there is no incentive to move to the center because in these safe seats in particular, the only challenge to a congressional career comes from the right or the left. That is, in a Republican safe seat, if a Republican moves to the center, that Republican will be challenged by someone from the right who will hold that candidate does not have the conviction to man the post or woman the post. Likewise, the same phenomenon on the Democratic side. And so the inevitable result is a polarizing effect. Psychology 101 is that in Congress, an increasing number of issues, and also at the state legislature, but particularly Congress, are being defined as moral issues. And there are such things as moral issues, and it's important for people to stand up for their sense of morality. By the same token, if there's a moral issue and one person holds one position and one person another, it's self-evident that each side thinks the other has an immoral position. And there's a huge difference between the concept of judgmental differences and morality differences. And that, again, underscores that when you have any kind of governmental body or any private kind of body, if you can't have some sort of bond of common respect, it's pretty hard to operate in a collective, careful way. Philosophy 101 is that legislation is increasingly driven by partisan concerns other than consideration for philosophical questions. The abstract is out of the vocabulary of American politics. The notion of the public good is not referred to much anymore. You may recall that in the 19th century, there's a British movement called the utilitarian movement, the greatest good for the greatest number. These kinds of conceptualizations aren't in play. What are in play are conceptualizations of what do we do for the base and what do we do for the interest groups, particularly the interest groups that supply money in the political process. And again, these are quite polarizing circumstances. Philosophy 102 is that there is something about the human condition that people want to make decisions at a local level. But many of the factors in politics are being nationalized. Money in politics is now a national phenomenon. National interest groups, movements at the left and the right are often national movements rather than local. And so not only is the middle not represented, often the geographic region is not principally represented, whether it be a rural state that gets a lot of labor union money on the Democratic side, oil money on the Republican side. These are not representatives of what happens in these rural states. But there is a lot of attention to this word globalism, and it's a very valid circumstance. But what has gotten a lot less attention around the world is an almost a deep-seated instinct towards localism. And it's combining an understanding of globalism with localism that is so key to understanding world and domestic affairs, but it's also a awkward aspect of the political process itself. Journalism 101, and it's one of the most intriguing aspects of what we see happening around us, because what is being reported about politics becomes what is publicly important, whether the public chooses it to be important or not. And there are a lot of historical analogies with what we're seeing today, and then a lot of unprecedented aspects. That, and in terms of analogies, in the 19th century, virtually every city of any size had several or quite a number of newspapers, virtually all of which identified with a political party, virtually none of which were considered to be perfectly balanced. Then in the 20th century, as there was a consolidation in newspapers and then the introduction of radio and television, there was an initial reaction that to appeal to wider audiences, one had to be more balanced and perhaps provide deeper perspectives. And the three original networks used to truly vie, in their own judgment at least, but that was important, to present the most thoughtful and the most balanced news. And then with the introduction of the internet, we have this phenomenon of a lot more sources, and then you had the problem of more participants and the same amount of money, which meant that a lot of the media has come under hard times financially, and then media figuring out that there might be some financial advantages, or for ideological reasons has suddenly started to come back to the 19th century model of appealing to groups. And so just like a marketer of women's clothes might be looking at a particular market base, marketers of news are looking to a particular market base, and that has nothing to do with depth or balance. It has everything to do with appealing to a particular perspective, and then that perspective gets reinforced without much attention to the other side. And so this concept of the mutual or the common jeopardization of financial viability with the movement towards sources that are not balanced is continues this trend towards what might be considered greater cleavages in American politics. Sports 101 is a course I would reference that relates back to the great journalist that none of us know, but all of us remember for a quote, and that's Grantland Rice when he said, winning isn't the most important thing, it's how you play the game. Well, likewise in politics, the temper and the integrity of the political process is, and close to the words of your president, more important in many ways than the outcome of any issue. in politics, there aren't a lot of rules. There are few referees, and the public has to always be on guard. But I like this words, although I apply them different meaning than Walt Whitman did, and that is, I think America ought to really fight to have an athletic democracy in the sense of people looking at fairness and then looking at the sports mentality. I mean, there is no good coach or good team in America that doesn't begin with the discipline of hard work and the discipline of respecting an opponent. You look at this recent series of bowl games and the great play that took place. And after every game, the teams came up and put their arms around each other. You don't see that in politics. Sports has come up with a higher ethic than the American political ethic. And I think we ought to be asking ourselves if the vigorous competition in sports can be carried out in a given kind of way, shouldn't we expect the same in the political process? I have a course called Literature 101, which is a singular course about a singular author, and that being when I was in college, the fashionable set of books to read was the Alexandria Quartet by a British author named Lawrence Durrell. And I don't want to go into these books except to make this observation that this British author wrote 4 books on the same subject matter set in the town of Alexandria, Egypt, between World War I and World War II. And there was no great plot, but the moral was that each of these books were written in the first person from the perspective of a different participant in the same set of events. And you wonder why read about the same thing more than once. And it ends up that all 4 stories are totally different, with the implication or moral that to get any sense for reality, you need to look at things from more than one set of eyes. That has something to do with if one thinks about a courtroom proceeding or if one thinks about international relations. I mean, what America does in the world might be terribly reasonable from an American perspective, look a little different from a European or Middle Eastern or African or Asian. And somehow we've got to be wise enough to, again, put ourselves in the shoes of others or seek the advice of others. Physics 101 is my favorite course, and it all began with an observation on the House floor in the mid-'90s about a then Speaker of the House whose first name was Newt. And so I call this the Fourth Newtonian Law. And you may recall in physics, Sir Isaac Newton had 3 laws of nature, and one of which was for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. That is, action equals reaction. Well, I was watching a particularly gifted talk, but then looking across the aisle at the reaction of the other party that the speaker was haranguing, and it dawned on me that reaction in social chemistry could be greater than action. And if, for example, someone maligns someone else, if a president calls a country evil, will the reaction be positive? If it's negative, will it be equal, or might it be substantially greater than what one might have suspected would occur? Again, at the center of this are words. Reality 101 is that in probably the most profound political observation of the 20th century, Einstein suggested that splitting the atom had changed everything except our way of thinking. Human nature may be one of the great constants of history. But what Einstein was suggesting is we've got to, with this notion of for the first time in human history, that one has the capacity not just to wage war, but destroy the civilization, to begin to think somewhat differently. Intriguingly, with 9/11, we're seeing that for the first time in human history, the globalization of terrorism. Terrorism has been with us almost from the beginning, but the globalization has not. And I think we're going to have to recognize the extraordinary power of small acts, as well as the vulnerability of the most sophisticated small acts. And so, I mean, for example, a bomb going off in a undeveloped region of the world can cause harm. But it's a bomb that may affect a small number of people. A bomb going off next to a concentrated act of what we consider to be an advanced civilized society next to a big building can cause a lot of harm. And likewise to the infrastructure of our society, whatever that infrastructure you might be thinking of, but particularly related to energy, electric grids, et cetera. And so what it means is that those people that are responding with terrorism are also reaching out to try to seek some sort of equality with bigger powers. And we're going to have to understand them better and deal with them in ways that least cause danger to our own citizens. Reality 102 is, in Western civilization's probably most prophetic poem, which was The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats, there is a suggestion that the center cannot hold when the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And it seems that citizens of all philosophical persuasions are expressing a lot of angst at society, having nothing to do with republicanism, Democrat, having a lot to do with the fast change and the acceleration of change in everybody's life, the difficult aspects of dealing with a circumstance where many people will have many, many different jobs in life, and some will have virtually none, while others might have a steady occupation. But change is discombobulating, and it produces angst and anger. And also it causes candidates to play off that, and candidates that tear down rather than uplift, or candidates that, if they prevail, and everyone that follows politics knows that all candidates say, all publics say they don't want to have too much negativism, but negative campaign ads work. And so for a self-centered way, there's hardly a candidate in America that doesn't emphasize certain negativity at critical points in a campaign. But if you run a campaign and you win on negativity, what's going to happen if one is a victor? How does one bring the country together? And it's an art that I think doesn't well exist. In any regard, past Congresses have been quite feisty. But what is particularly confounding about the current circumstance that has hints in American history, but not to the degree we have today, is that we now have a party system in which, over the last couple of decades, increasingly, the minority party has decided it should not cooperate with the majority. And what that means is that we are Europeanizing an aspect of American politics, that is, minority parties becoming the party of opposition. And that causes lots of difficulties. I mean, when I happened to have been elected to Congress in the mid-'70s, and when I entered that body, and I was in a definitive minority status, I felt that it was everybody's assumption that they were part of a governing apparatus, and that there are times you would certainly differ with the majority party, but when the majority party had a good idea, you would support it, and you might have amendments to modify it in one fashion or another, but everybody was part of governing. And today, there's a capitulation of the minority parties to responsibility for governing, and an assumption that any success is not good for the country, because it's good for the majority party, and anybody knows what's good for the majority party is not good for the country if one is in the minority. And that is not a very logical way of thinking for the country. And I think far better it would be just for legislators to consider themselves part of society at home, and it's absolutely irrational to think that a Republican cannot find a Democratic idea or two that isn't good for the country, or that a Democrat should not find a Republican amendment or two to vote for. And we now have a situation that the majority party considers itself the exclusive party of governance. All compromises are within it, and that's either by choice or default. And the minority party is in the opposite position. And my sense is, whether we come at issues from a conservative or liberal or moderate direction, each of us has to address one very important question, and that is, if we can't respect our neighbors, how can we expect others to respect us and our way of life? Civilization requires civility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leach. That was the best series of 2-minute lectures that I've ever heard. The chairman has graciously consented to answer any questions you may have for a little bit. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the role of technology, sort of alluded to the media. Could you expand on that a little bit in terms of whether you think the media is driving wedges in between or merely reporting on wedges that already exist in the society?
Well, I think there's a little bit of everything. At first, it's not all bad. And as I mentioned at a group the president assembled earlier today, that all educated Americans or people with access to the internet have access to a phenomenal variety of sources. And some of this is really first class. The academic work on so many areas is really quite impressive today. And that is the equivalent of news. And so if newspapers are sliding in their depth, there are other places to get it. And so that's the plus side. On the minus side is the very clear gotcha aspect of certain journalism. And it's very awkward. And I don't like to mention networks, but they're self-evident. And then you do have some really bellwether circumstances that this country should be very proud. National Public Radio, public broadcasting are really doing a first-class job. And frankly, some of the networks do a good job and do a very good job. And then I used to suggest to people, and my colleagues in the Congress hated to hear this, but some of American journalism is as wonderful as has ever existed. And for example, some of our journalists, like Tom Friedman of the New York Times, E.J. Dionne, David Broder, some of the syndicated columnists are truly brilliant, and they're great conservative writers. I mean, George Will is a absolutely sterling intellect who provides a terrific perspective. And heavens to have as a journalist the recent Nobel Prize winner in economics, Paul Krugman, is impressive as the daylights. And Paul has a brilliant pen. And so there are aspects of journalism that are still very good. But when you look at what's happening in newspapers and the weakening of the number of staff to begin with, weakening of international reporting, weakening of investigative reporting, It's not a happy time for journalism. Yes. Well, there are a lot of models of friendships, and they do exist between the parties. We all think personally. I will tell you, I always felt that Tip O'Neill was the fairest partisan I ever met. And I had a rule in politics never to ask a favor of anybody. But Tip is the only one that ever did me a favor. And nobody in this room would think it very consequential, I suspect. But when I was in my second or third term, I wanted to get on another committee. And I was on the banking committee, and I wanted to also be on the International Relations Committee. And my party said, sure, you can do it, but you have to give up banking, which I couldn't, for a lot of reasons, do. But the day before we were to come out with the decisions on committees, Tip called the minority leader of the House and said they would add a seat to the International Relations Committee, but only if they gave it to me. And I thought that was pretty nice. And no one else thought it was of any significance. I'd never known it happening before. No one else had ever known it happening, but all I can tell you, I was appreciative. But there are many examples in Congress of movements. We had one of the great absolute anti-FDR isolationist Republican senators from Michigan who at the end of World War II suddenly co-authored the Marshall Plan, which was one of the most extraordinary internationalist progressive initiatives in the history of the United States Congress. Likewise, we've had times in American history of foolish partisanship. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was idealistic and not always right, but he was definitively right about the League of Nations. And it was irrational that the United States Senate turned down the League of Nations after America had led the world. And one of the interesting minor footnotes of that historically was that the Democratic vice presidential candidate in 1920 was a man named Franklin Roosevelt, and he gave several hundred speeches advocating the League of Nations, and his argument was the opposite of Woodrow Wilson's, which was all about idealism. FDR said, if we don't join, those Europeans will control international relations. And if you want to have an American voice, you can't do it from empty chair diplomacy. Really kind of a realpolitik internationalist dimension. And the Republicans, A, were philosophically doubtful, and B, didn't want to follow the lead of the United States president. We had the exact same thing at the end of the 20th century when the United States Senate, in what is the least noted, to me, shameful act, turned down a comprehensive test ban. And the debate in the Senate floor was all about this reason, that reason, another reason. But the real reason was they didn't like Bill Clinton. Well, I wasn't fond of Bill Clinton either. But Bill Clinton was right about a position that was held by Dwight David Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, every president from Eisenhower on. And yet our Senate turned it down, and I'll be darned if I don't think the fundamental reason wasn't partisan. And so we have incidents in our history that are awkward, and we just have to think better. Yes?
One of the things that you just said in the speech is that the mode of discourse, the civility of the discourse, is sometimes just as important as the outcome of the discourse. And to me, that strikes me as completely false. Because you can imagine many situations, a piece of legislation, the passage of which would benefit many of the worst off people in society. It fails. We then say,
Well, I will agree with you about 10%, maybe even 20%. There are times one has to go against majority opinion for sure. But civil discourse isn't simply about being polite. It's about being not close-minded. And I have very seldom gone into a meeting where I had a pretty good sense of what I wanted to see the outcome, that if I listened to other people, wouldn't slightly modify something. And that's particularly true of the legislative process. And so if you say the issue is politeness, there's a role for politeness, but that's not the be-all and end-all. But there is a role, if you differ from me, that I should listen to you and think it through. And that is really important. And that is what civility is about. This is not just manners. But I do concur with you that there are times and places that we can talk very politely. But that doesn't mean I should accept what you've said. It means that I should ponder it. I had a rule in politics that there would be numerous times that I would know the majority of my constituents differed with me. And in those circumstances, it was my obligation to go out of my way to listen and find out why, but always to come down on what I thought was right. And I think that the key is that one has to exercise judgment. But the more complicated our society, there just aren't any issues that someone should think of themselves of sage-like capacities. I used to think as a representative of people about the only thing that I should with confidence know normally more than any of my constituents was about process within Congress. But there was not a single issue that there weren't some constituents of mine or many constituents of mine that wouldn't know a lot more about than me. And a public official is a representative not only of the people, but a representative that has to listen to the people before becoming too convinced of a particular perspective. Yes, sir.
You spoke of the relationship between global and local thinking. And many of us now are looking at, on a national basis, what they perceive to be a decline in the humanities and higher education. But the importance of the humanities couldn't be greater in this kind of political and social environment. Thinking nationally and speaking to us here in this state, probably one of the few times we'll get a chance to interact with you, what are some of the initiatives you might have in mind from your point of view as chairman of the National Endowment that might reflect on what we might do in our own local areas to promote the quality of thinking and acting that you spoke to so eloquently?
Well, that's a profound question that I wish I had a quick answer to. I don't. But let me first agree with your premise. Statistically, in higher academia, the increasing emphasis is on job-related disciplines rather than the humanities. And that is throughout our society. On the other hand, from a job perspective, survey after survey of business leadership in America wants people that have a background in the humanities, whether they be a background in languages, a background in history. And the humanities, if in a change-oriented world, are all about how you deal with a wider variety of thought that stretches the imagination. And the imagination is what one needs to rely on the most when change is around the corner. Likewise, in all learning, there's a cost. But if you think about the cost of not paying attention to the humanities, it can be rather towering. And I don't mean to get into decision-making that is for which there is a lot of disagreement, but let's say you're a citizen who is doubtful about going to war in Iraq or doubtful about the prosecution of the war in Iraq. Would it have been helpful for our decision makers to have a greater sense for the history and philosophy of the region? I guarantee you in the year 2000, there was hardly a soul in the Congress that knew a distinction between Sunni and Shia. There were some in the government, but those in government that knew much about it were in departments that were pressed out of the decision-making process. I think in terms of international trade. America has lost a great deal of resources by war, but we've lost possibly comparable amounts on the attitudes that have changed about America. There are large numbers of people in the world that, if given a choice, will not buy an American product. That's incredibly significant. Should we not, as a society, think in terms that maybe we want to learn more about other societies and learn more about the other? And we've had the good fortune of being brought up in a country that has been a little bit more isolated by oceans from other societies than some places in the world. But I don't think we can afford to think of ourselves as that kind of isolated fortress. So there's a cost to all of this. Now, you've asked me personally. All I can tell you is that I advocate for the humanities based upon what's happening in the budgeting process at the federal level coming up. We're going to be lucky to maintain funding levels at all comparable to where we are today. Based on American politics, they might be reduced. In every state in the country, support for your state universities is being undercut. And I will tell you, as an advocate of state universities, I would hope state legislators would recognize that you can't deny the future. If you take one of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, one of the most interesting aspects of his tenureship as president was that in 1863 he signed something called the Morrill Act. That is, in the middle of this great Civil War, he established land-grant colleges in the United States. One of the greatest steps towards higher education the country's taken, next only to the GI Bills. So I will tell you, I will be your advocate. Now, in terms of models, the National Endowment for the Humanities is an institution in Washington that is responsible for 0.6 of 1,000th of 1% of federal outlays. We have, as I sometimes jokingly tell my friends, state humanities councils that we provide about half the resources an average to. And so we're a little bit like a domestic State Department in the humanities, with the distinction being in the State Department, Washington gives directions to an embassy and the embassy follows them. In the humanities, the state humanities councils are independent operations, and most of them are far more creative than Washington. And what your state humanities councils have been doing is absolutely superb. And so I would wish I could support them with more money from NEH, but we don't have a lot more money. And so I'm hopeful that the legislature in South Carolina, the people of South Carolina, would recognize what a terrific council you have here and could support it and its activities. But the humanities are far more than any age the state humanities councils. They're imbued in the communities in many different ways. Libraries, almost every academic institution, lots of other parts of social structure. And I just think it important that people think about the humanities and what they are. And part of what they are, I mean, in an academic discipline sense, they might be history, literature, philosophy, anthropology, art, criticism, and dozens of other related subjects. But in community, they're often how human beings interrelate with each other. And so the question is, what kind of civilizing institutions do we want to have? And here at the University of South Carolina, President Pastides has done a really extraordinary job in leading a university movement in thinking about humanities. And I hope the state legislature recognizes that and recognizes the importance of this university at this time. Yes, sir.
Congressman Leach, would you comment, this is sort of two-pronged, but very related question. Would you comment on the recent incident when the president was addressing Congress and a congressman from South Carolina shouted out, "You lied." And then related to that, over the next several days, the congressman who did that received $3 million in additional campaign funds coming in. And his anticipated opponent for the other party received about $2 million.
Well, I don't know what to comment other than I'm not here to join a political battle. I will tell you that I served with Joe, and I always found him quite a decent guy, and so I was a little surprised by this. But it's not for me to enter that kind of political fray. That's for citizens of South Carolina to parse.
One final question.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, is there a way that we might get a copy of your 101, 102 lectures at some point in time? Because
Well,
you're delivering this around the country, and when will they be available for us to read?
Well, I will put this up on my website, which is in the next 3 or 4 days. I must tell you, I was taking some notes earlier today, and so this is what several of the pages look like. Thank you. Okay.
Well, I can't
Thank you all.
think of a higher note on which to end our evening. I know those of us from Gown, as well as those of us from town, thoroughly enjoyed this. Please help me welcome thank our outstanding speaker, Jim Leach, one more time.